Run your tongue along the back of your two front teeth right now. Do it before you keep reading, because the answer changes everything you thought you knew about your own mouth. If you feel a smooth, flat surface, this video is not about you. But if you feel a small ridge, a slight scoop, a shallow valley carved into the enamel, then you are carrying a genetic signature that scientists only fully confirmed inside a Harvard laboratory in February 2013, and that signature reaches back through more than 1,000 centuries of human survival, hidden in plain sight in a place you touch with your tongue every single day without ever realizing what it meant. In that year, a team led by geneticist Yana Kambarov, working with Harvard evolutionary biologist Pardis Sabeti and Bruce Morgan, published a study that did something no dental textbook had ever managed. They took a single mutated gene, inserted it into a strain of laboratory mice, and watched the animals grow thicker hair, different sweat gland patterns, and altered mammary tissue almost overnight. The gene was EDAR. The mutation was called 370A. And the moment that paper appeared in the journal Cell, an old and painful mystery that had followed millions of people their entire lives finally had an origin story written in cold, testable science rather than guesswork. For as long as you can remember, you were probably given a handful of tired, half-satisfying explanations for your crowded, overlapping, or crooked teeth. Explanations that never quite matched how often this exact pattern turned up across entire communities, rather than isolated households. Maybe a relative blamed thumb-sucking, maybe an orthodontist shrugged and said your jaw was simply too small, or that wisdom teeth were the culprit, or that crooked smiles just ran in the family. None of those answers were wrong exactly, but none of them touched the real depth of the story. Because behind the crowded smiles that show up generation after generation in families with East Asian and indigenous American ancestry, there is a single ancient genetic event, a mutation that swept across an entire population of humans somewhere in central China, roughly 30,000 years ago in the frozen depths of the last ice age. That mutation did not just reshape teeth, it rewrote hair texture, sweat gland density, and even breast tissue structure across an entire branch of humanity. And it is still doing all of that inside your body today, whether you have ever heard its name or not. If your ancestry traces to China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, the Philippines, Mongolia, Siberia, or the indigenous nations of North and South America, this is your story, written into your bones before writing itself even existed. And the crowded teeth so many people in these communities grew up feeling self-conscious about are not a personal flaw. They are a fingerprint left by ancestors who survived conditions most of us alive today could not endure for even a single week. Before we go further into how this mutation was discovered and why it spread so successfully, take a second and think about your own family. The cousin whose canine tooth always sat slightly forward. The grandmother who smiled with her lips together, hiding a crowded row she never had the chance to fix. The sibling rivalry over whose front teeth were the most stubborn. These are not isolated coincidences. They are recurring, cross-generational, cross-national patterns that dentists in East Asia and in indigenous communities across the Americas had been quietly documenting for decades, long before Western genetics caught up and explained why. The formal scientific hunt for an explanation goes back further than the 2013 Harvard mouse study. In 2008, a research team led by population geneticist Jaroslav Brick, working alongside Mark Stoneking and colleagues, published evidence in the journal PLOS One that a specific change at position 370 in the EDAR gene had been pushed to extremely high frequency across East Asia by strong positive natural selection sometime before 10,000 years ago. Using an in vitro laboratory assay, the team showed that this version of the gene, referred to as EDAR 370A, dramatically increased the activity of a cellular signaling pathway called NF-kappa B, a pathway deeply involved in how skin, hair follicles, sweat glands, and teeth are built during embryonic development. This was the first hard proof that the mutation was not simply present in East Asian populations by accident. It had been actively favored, spread, and locked in by evolution because it gave real advantages to the people who carried it. The gene itself, EDAR, stands for ectodysplasin A receptor. That name sounds clinical and forgettable, but the gene sits at the control center of something scientists call ectodermal development. The ectoderm is the outer layer of cells in a developing embryo, the layer that eventually becomes skin, hair, nails, sweat glands, and teeth. Because EDR sits so early and so centrally in that developmental process, a single change in its instructions does not alter just one feature. It ripples outward, touching a whole cluster of physical traits at once, the same way changing one setting on a factory's master control panel changes dozens of products coming off the line. Later genetic dating work, including analysis published through Harvard and cited widely afterward, placed the origin of the 370A mutation at approximately 30,000 years ago, most likely arising in a single individual somewhere in what is now central China. We do not know that person's name, their sex, or their exact life story. North and South America, whose ancestors carried the mutation across the ancient land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska. That land bridge, sometimes called Beringia, existed because sea levels during the last ice age were far lower than they are today, exposing a wide corridor of grassland connecting Asia and the Americas. Mammoths, ancient horses, and small bands of human hunters moved across that corridor while glaciers locked up much of the world's water. Life there was brutal, almost beyond imagining. Winters could kill within minutes of exposure. Food often had to be pulled frozen from carcasses or torn directly with the teeth because tools were limited and shelter was scarce. In that setting, any trait that improved a person's odds of surviving winter, processing tough food, or keeping infants alive and fed carried enormous evolutionary weight. And researchers now believe the EDAR mutation delivered exactly that kind of advantage across several fronts at once. This is why the same shovel-shaped incisors and the same crowded, ridged smiles show up not just across East Asia, but across an ocean and an entire hemisphere away, in populations that never had any direct contact with China or Japan in recorded history, Inuit communities across the Arctic, Maya populations in Central America, Andean peoples in South America, countless other indigenous nations across both American continents carry the EDAR 370A variant at strikingly high frequencies, a genetic signature inherited directly from that small founding population that crossed Beringia thousands of years before any written record existed anywhere on Earth. For geneticists, this shared dental signature has become one of the clearest and most physically visible pieces of evidence, confirming that the first peoples of the Americas descended from that same ancient Northeastern Asian population, a connection written into enamel long before any written language could describe it. Consider the hair first. Carriers of EDAR 370A grow hair shafts that are measurably thicker in cross-section and straighter than the hair of non-carriers, a difference confirmed through direct measurement in both human populations and in the Harvard mouse models. Thicker, straighter hair traps a denser layer of warm air close to the scalp, offering a small but real thermal advantage in extreme cold. Then consider sweat glands. Multiple studies, including work on Han Chinese populations, found that carriers of the mutation have a significantly higher density of eccrine sweat glands, particularly on the palms and forearms, which likely helped regulate body temperature as populations expanded from colder northern regions into warmer, more humid environments further south. The mammary gland effect is one of the more surprising discoveries to come out of this research. Studies have found that EDAR 370A carriers tend to have denser mammary ductal branching, meaning a more complex internal structure of milk-producing tissue. A 2018 study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, proposed a striking explanation. Researchers there suggested that this denser ductal branching may have improved the transfer of vitamin D and essential fatty acids from mother to infant through breast milk during the depths of the Ice Age, a period when sunlight exposure across northern latitudes would have been dangerously limited for much of the year, making dietary vitamin D transfer through nursing a genuine survival bottleneck for infants. The same EDAR signature responsible for shovel-shaped incisors is also, quite literally, responsible for the thick, straight, glossy hair texture so heavily featured in global beauty marketing and so strongly associated with East Asian identity in popular culture. It is responsible for a measurable difference in sweat gland density that most people, carrying it, have never once thought to attribute to their ancestry. And it is responsible for differences in mammary tissue structure that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with keeping Ice Age infants alive through nutrient-poor winters. 4 traits spanning hair, skin, glandular tissue, and dentition, all tracing back to one tiny change in one gene, inherited together as a package, whether or not any individual carrier ever develops crowded teeth severe enough to need correction. Few single mutations in the entire human genome have been shown to influence this many visible, everyday physical traits at once, which is part of why EDAR has become one of the most studied genes in modern human evolutionary biology. And then there are the teeth, the feature that gives this story its name and its emotional weight for so many families today. Carriers of the EDAR 370A mutation tend to develop what dental researchers call shovel-shaped incisors. If you felt that subtle ridge and scoop on the back of your own front teeth earlier in this video, that shape is what you were touching. Today, forensic dentists and physical anthropologists can often estimate a person's broad ancestral background simply by examining the back surface of the upper front teeth, because the shovel pattern points so consistently back toward that same ancient population in northeastern Asia. So if this mutation gave ancient humans thicker hair for warmth, denser sweat glands for temperature regulation, richer milk for infants, and tougher, more functional teeth, all wrapped into a single genetic change, why does that same inheritance now show up in millions of people as crowding, overlap, and orthodontic headaches, rather than an obvious evolutionary gift? In February 2015, a research team led by Ron Pinhasi at University College Dublin published a detailed study in the journal PLOS1, analyzing 292 archaeological skeletons from the Levant, Anatolia, and Europe, spanning roughly 28,000 to 6,000 years ago. Their findings were striking. Hunter-gatherer populations showed what the researchers described as almost perfect harmony between jaw size and tooth size, with almost no malocclusion or dental crowding at all. But the moment a population transitioned to early agriculture, that harmony broke down. Malocclusion and crowded teeth became common within a relatively short span of generations, and the researchers traced the cause directly to diet. Hunter-gatherers ate hard, raw, fibrous, unprocessed food that demanded hours of vigorous chewing every single day throughout childhood, and that mechanical stress stimulated the growing jawbone to develop wide and long, creating ample room for every tooth, including the wisdom teeth so many people today have surgically removed. Early farmers, by contrast, shifted towards softer, cooked, processed grains and legumes that required dramatically less chewing force, and their jaws simply stopped receiving the developmental signal to grow to that same full ancestral size. This idea has become known among anthropologists as a mismatch, and Harvard evolutionary biologist Daniel Lieberman has spent much of his career documenting exactly this pattern by comparing skull collections spanning tens of thousands of years. Looking across those collections, researchers have repeatedly found that ancient hunter-gatherer jaws show remarkably little crowding or impacted teeth, while skulls, from more recent agricultural and industrial societies, show a sharp rise in exactly those problems. National Geographic summarized this research simply, explaining that early hunter-gatherers had large, powerful jaws built for demanding chewing, while the shift towards softer, processed food gradually allowed the jaw to shrink without a matching reduction in tooth size, creating a genuine structural mismatch between the space available and the number of teeth trying to fit inside it. It gave them slightly larger, thicker, more robust teeth, with wider crowns and sturdier roots than average, an advantage during the Ice Age when tough, resistant teeth meant better access to nutrition and better tools for daily survival. But East Asian populations were also, independently, some of the earliest and most sophisticated agricultural innovators on the planet. Rice cultivation began in the Yangtze River Valley of China, somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago. Millet was domesticated on the plains further north around the same period. Alongside these crops came some of the earliest widespread cooking technologies for softening food, including steaming and staple dishes built specifically around soft textures, from rice porridge to noodles to soft buns and dumplings. Foods that required a fraction of the chewing effort of raw meat or fibrous wild plants. The result was a kind of genetic and cultural double impact. Populations carrying the EDAR mutation already had teeth on the larger end of the human range. Then, earlier and more thoroughly than in many other parts of the world, those same populations transitioned toward some of the softest staple diets in existence, which meant their jaws developed with less room precisely at the moment their teeth needed more of it. The crowding, overlapping, and orthodontic struggles that show up in family after family are not a flaw layered onto an otherwise perfect design. They are the visible collision point of two entirely separate evolutionary stories, one written by Ice Age survival and one written by agricultural genius, both converging on the exact same mouth. Some variants in these genes can cause certain teeth to be congenitally missing, most commonly the upper lateral incisors or the third molars. Others shift exactly when adult teeth erupt through the gum line, sometimes delaying eruption by months or even years compared to siblings carrying different variants. Still, others subtly alter the curvature of the dental arch itself, meaning two people can inherit identical EDR variants and still end up with noticeably different degrees of crowding, depending entirely on which combination of these secondary genes rode along with it. When researchers study families with persistent crowding across multiple generations, they frequently find several of these variants layered together, working alongside the EDAR signature rather than replacing it. Crooked teeth, in other words, are rarely the product of one gene acting in isolation. They are the result of an inherited chorus of traits, most of them ancient, some more ancient than agriculture itself, and some newer than the last ice age, but still passed down long before anyone in your family understood what genetics even was. This layered inheritance is also why forensic anthropologists and archaeologists treat dental morphology as such a valuable tool when identifying unknown remains or reconstructing migration routes from skeletal evidence alone. A shoveled incisor, combined with a particular arch shape and a particular pattern of missing or delayed teeth, can narrow down a population of origin with surprising precision, sometimes even in the complete absence of any preserved DNA to test directly. In cases where ancient bones have degraded too badly for genetic sequencing to succeed, the teeth themselves can still tell part of the story, because enamel is the hardest, most durable tissue in the entire human body, and often survives burial conditions that destroy almost everything else. There is also a genuinely fascinating twist involving a second EDAR variant that scientists only fully characterized in more recent research. A study describing a separate mutation known as EDAR 380R found that this variant reaches its highest frequency, up to around 5%, specifically in populations across southern China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Laboratory testing showed that EDAR 380R boosts the same cellular signaling pathway as the more famous 370A variant to a similar degree, yet it arose independently on a separate genetic background and does not show the same overwhelming signature of powerful positive selection. Its existence suggests that different regions of East and Southeast Asia experience their own distinct evolutionary pressure on this same gene pathway, adding yet another layer to an already complex genetic story that stretches from Siberia down through the tropical islands of the Pacific. Ancient DNA has since added an entirely independent layer of confirmation to this timeline, and this is the part of the story that turns a laboratory finding into something closer to a detective case cracked wide open. Researchers sequencing genomes recovered from Ice Age human remains across Siberia and northern China, some of them tens of thousands of years old, have been able to track the 370A variant appearing, then rapidly rising in frequency, in exactly the geographic window and time frame the earlier lab-based dating had predicted. That kind of independent confirmation, one line of evidence built from living populations and modern genetics, another built from DNA extracted directly out of ancient bone, is exactly what gives scientists confidence that this mutation's Ice Age origin story is not speculation. It is a convergence of multiple entirely separate methods arriving at the same conclusion, which in genetics is about as close to certainty as researchers ever get. Speaking of the Pacific, the reach of the original EDAR mutation extends far beyond the Asian mainland. As ancient seafaring peoples expanded across the ocean into Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia, they carried the mutation with them, embedding it into the genetic heritage of island populations scattered across thousands of miles of open water. Combined with its extremely high frequency across East Asia and the Americas, EDR 370A is now considered one of the most successful and far-reaching adaptive mutations in recent human evolutionary history, quietly present in an enormous share of the people alive on Earth today, most of whom have never once heard its name. None of this changes the very real present-day experience of living with crowded or crooked teeth. Malocclusion. Today affects roughly 1 in 5 people across modern populations worldwide, and for many people it means genuine discomfort, difficulty chewing, self-consciousness about smiling in photographs, or years spent in orthodontic treatment as a child or an adult, treatment that can stretch across braces, retainers, and sometimes jaw surgery before it is finally finished. What this research does change is the framing. A crowded smile is not evidence of bad luck, poor hygiene, or a flaw unique to your family. It is a physical record of 2 of the most consequential chapters in human history, an Ice Age adaptation that helped your ancestors survive brutal cold and nourish their infants, and an agricultural revolution that later reshaped diet and jaw growth for thousands of years afterward. Both chapters are written into the same mouth, arriving together in your reflection every single morning. Modern dentistry, fortunately, has caught up with a mismatch that biology alone will not solve on its own. Orthodontic techniques today, many of them refined and advanced significantly within East Asia itself, are remarkably effective at widening dental arches, correcting crowding, and managing impacted teeth safely, especially when treatment begins in childhood while the jaw is still actively developing. Researchers are increasingly focused on prevention as well, studying whether encouraging more mechanically demanding foods during early childhood, foods that actually require sustained, deliberate chewing, might help stimulate healthier jaw development before crowding becomes severe, rather than relying solely on correction after the fact. Once the jaw has already finished most of its growth, there's a further wrinkle to this story that many researchers now find genuinely alarming, and it concerns the generation being born today. The industrial food systems that now dominate diets worldwide produce meals softer, more processed, and less mechanically demanding than almost anything humans have ever eaten before. Softer even than the rice porridge and noodle dishes that already reduced chewing loads across East Asia thousands of years ago. Children growing up on heavily processed, pre-softened foods rarely exercise their developing jaws with the sustained, forceful chewing that shaped hunter-gatherer skulls into wide, roomy arches capable of holding every tooth without a fight for space. Some researchers now argue that impacted wisdom teeth, crowded incisors, and the enormous modern demand for orthodontic correction are not simply the price of ancient genetics catching up with us, but a problem actively being made worse with every generation that eats softer food than the one before it. Wisdom tooth impaction alone is now common enough that a large share of people in industrialized nations will have at least one wisdom tooth surgically removed at some point in their lives. a procedure that was almost unheard of in the skeletal record of ancient hunter-gatherer populations, whose jaws had ample room for every single tooth nature intended them to grow. There is something worth sitting with in all of this. The straight, symmetrical smile, so heavily promoted in modern advertising, is an extremely recent invention when measured against the full span of human history. For the overwhelming majority of the time our species has existed, smiles were simply smiles, shaped by whatever combination of ancient genetics and daily diet a person happened to inherit, without any cultural standard demanding uniform alignment. The crowded, overlapping smile passed down through your family across generations is not a problem waiting to be apologized for. It is a living record of a journey that began in the freezing grasslands of Ice Age Asia, continued across a land bridge that no longer exists, passed through some of the earliest rice paddies and noodle kitchens in human history, and arrived, finally, in the mirror in front of you this morning. Very few features on the human body carry that much compressed history in such a small, visible space. Somewhere on a frozen plain that no longer exists, one ancestor's tiny genetic accident became your family's inheritance, and every crowded smile since has simply been that inheritance quietly doing exactly what it was built to do.